I had originally intended to address the Me Too movement and queer theory together in a single essay, but instead I'm breaking them into two. First, because both of these issues are rather complex on their own in ways that are not so easily simplified as those issues that I've already addressed. Addressing feminism in a single half-essay was really only possible knowing that I would be going into greater detail later. And the issues of gender violence and gender identity are two such issues. Second, the topics of gender violence and gender identity do not pair especially well with each other, so it made little sense to cram the two of them together. As a result, this essay is going to address the Me Too campaign in isolation. In particular, the topic will involve the effect of Me Too on the relations between men and women. I intend to demonstrate that although the Me Too campaign had the laudable and universally supported goal of spotlighting the prominence and severe harm of sexual harassment in the workplace and offering women a greater means of protection against such behavior, Me Too accomplished these goals in such a way that effectively ended workplace interactions between men and women. I should note here the similarity between Me Too and matters regarding Title IX on college campuses, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus exclusively on the first. This problem goes deeper than men's uncontrolled sexual urges, and it is ultimately founded on a mutual misunderstanding between men and women and an absence of rules to govern our interactions with one another. I will also address the twofold issue of domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, and sexual violence. Although sexual violence is more often committed by men against women, domestic violence should be understood as truly bidirectional. And on the matter of sexual violence, most sexual violence committed by women against men is ignored. As a result, the common narrative that men abuse women is, well, at least partially false. The truth is that men and women abuse each other. Rather than continuing to treat physical and sexual violence as a wedge issue or as wedge issues to drive the sexes apart, we ought to recognize that these are universal concerns that we should be rallying around together. But first, I want to address the issue of Me Too and courtship. Me Too was originally conceived by Tarana Burke in 2006 as a way to draw attention to survivors of sexual harassment and sexual assault. It did not catch on until October 2017, when it was used by a group of whistleblowers to identify a widespread culture of demanding sexual favors in exchange for career advancement in Hollywood, particularly by director-producer Harvey Weinstein. The group of whistleblowers primarily included actresses Alyssa Milano, Ashley Judd, and Rose McGowan. The whole movement itself was essentially set off by a tweet from Milano in which she encouraged survivors of sexual harassment to share the phrase "Me Too" through social media in the hope of bringing attention to how widespread the problem is. Consequently, over 200 major figures were ousted as sexual criminals and sentenced to prison time. To quote Peggy Ehrenstein, the reaction of society was something like, "Then came Me Too, and Harvey Weinstein, and Bill Cosby, and Louis C.K., and Kevin Spacey, and Matt Lauer, and shitty media men, and Travis Kalanick, and Roy Moore, and a pussy-grabbing president, and the nude photo-sharing scandal in the U.S. Marines, and Brock Turner, and Owen Labrie, and, for that matter, Aziz Ansari, and the viral New Yorker story Cat Person. The pervasiveness, the sheer magnitude of sexual misconduct across every sector of society by men, young and old, became glaringly and disturbingly obvious. Now, this explanation is crass and fairly opinionated, and I would note it is, absent Larry Nassar, in my opinion, the worst offender uncovered by the movement. The reality is that Orenstein is providing an accurate reflection of how we felt in the wake of Me Too. Ironically, although the movement garnered a great deal of attention for female victims of sexual crime, Me Too is perhaps best known for the unintentional side effects that it had. In particular, these were ignorance of male victims and the problem of false accusations. A great deal of attention was placed on the question, should we be concerned with male victims of sexual violence too? Now, this question was particularly significant in light of the case of Asia Argento, herself a Me Too advocate, who was accused by Jimmy Bennett, one of her male employees, of having sexually assaulted him. However, in response, Rose McGowan urged restraint, which drew a backlash, given the common trope of Me Too, that is, believe survivors, i.e., McGowan encouraged disbelief in the case of a male accuser and alleged female perpetrator, which was a stark contrast to the motto, believe all women. Now, Tarana Burke disagreed with McGowan's perspective and claimed that Me Too had never been gendered, even though she had claimed in a previous media piece that it was only about women. Put simply, the movement Me Too painted a picture of women as victims and men as predators only, and it only acknowledged the possibility of an alternative when it was unavoidable or found to be strategically useful in some way. The reality is that both sexes perpetrate and experience sexual violence against each other, meaning that in addition to women who experience atrocious behavior by men, there were well-behaving men and men who had themselves been sexually abused who were named as predators. And simultaneously, predatory women were quietly ignored. Me Too also raised serious questions about the possibility of false allegations and their potential impact. Although false accusations are no more common than any other form of crime, that is around 2 to 8%, we should not make the mistake of assuming that anyone who is truly innocent has nothing to fear from being accused. We saw from the scandal of the falsely accused Duke lacrosse athletes in 2007, through the Mattress Girl saga of the 2010s, and culminating in the defamation case of Johnny Depp against Amber Heard, that evidence strongly indicates the character damage done by any accusation of sexual misconduct, no matter whether or not that accusation is credible, the damage is unavoidable. In both instances, of course, male victims of sexual violence and the falsely accused, the primary narrative in media has been a negative one. Generally, the concerns of male victims of sexual violence and men falsely accused are considered insignificant in the face of the overwhelming number of women who fall prey to men's predatory instincts. And perhaps there is some sense to this. But to raise concerns about how men are treated by women is been treated as a sort of assault on women in itself. And in all of this, the question that appears to be ignored is, why is there no room in society for us to express and pursue concern for victims of both sexes. It is in the nature of a victimhood mentality to portray all society as a zero-sum competition for finite resources and to treat everyone outside one's own tribe as an enemy. So, with a matter like this that is framed around victimhood, the backlash was tragically predictable, and it should not be surprising that this has created an opportunity for men and women to treat one another as enemies. And the backlash came quickly. Within a year of Me Too, the internet began another discussion over the Mike Pence rule. That is, men who had begun refusing to interact with women alone under any circumstances, although this applied especially to work environments. This is a variation on the Billy Graham rule, and many commenters noted, and quite rightly, I would add, that the Billy Graham rule was a noble but frankly immature and inappropriate expression of male virtue. It is right and proper that husbands should take steps to ensure that they do not violate their marriage vows by having an affair, but they ought to have the character to draw appropriate boundaries in their interactions with women that do not draw such an excessively wide hedge of protection around their marriage. Surely, if men can maintain appropriate boundaries with women while they are single, and most men do, they ought to be capable of maintaining the same boundaries while married. Contrarily, surely most women who are respectful of marriage should be expected to choose to avoid making romantic overtures with a man who has already tied the knot with another woman. And again, here, most women do. Yet, these criticisms do not address the root cause for the surge in the Mike Pence rule. Even just a year out, researchers noticed that men had become wary of interacting with women in the workplace, and both men and women had become wary of hiring women. Men had additionally become especially careful about mentoring women under their leadership. After 2 years of Me Too, the effect had compounded beyond what researchers had initially anticipated. And they have been quick to point out further that this kind of a backlash has caused an ongoing harm to women's workplace aspirations because all of us rely on recommendations and mentorships to advance. In response to this trend, Sheryl Sandberg, founder of Lean In and Mentor Her, insisted that it is a form of sexism for men to refuse to meet with women privately. Likewise, Rachel Thomas, co-founder of Lean In, said, "Not harassing women is not enough. Being part of the solution means mentoring, sponsoring, and working one-on-one with women." What these reactions miss is the purpose behind the resurgence of the Mike Pence rule. It is not being applied simply to protect wives from the heartbreak of infidelity, but to protect men from the fear of false accusations. Demanding that men not do this, no matter how important or justified those demands might be, they cease to be a cry for help and they become a demand for special privilege. Unsurprisingly, this trend has perhaps had similar effects on dating and romance, although tying this specifically to Me Too is difficult given that all dating in the U.S. has been trending towards the internet over the last decade, and therefore away from workspace environments. But if dating trends are changing rapidly, and not least of which due to a certain pandemic, how can we tell if Me Too is responsible for shifting trends away from workplace romance? Well, again, we can't really, at least not with certainty. However, it's difficult to discount the fact that the narratives men abuse women and women falsely accuse men have become staples in our social narratives that are going to affect men and women who buy into them, not least of which in terms of how we relate to one another in the workplace. Now, of course, the only solution to this problem in the long run is a reassertion of a Christian anthropology that men and women were created for each other. More importantly, our fear of one another does not negate our need for one another. And our fear really only heightens our sense that interacting with one another is risky. And we can be honest that, especially when it comes to romantic interactions, it is risky. But with this said, one thing that we can do is look at those narratives themselves. In particular, is it true that men overwhelmingly victimize women? Well, yes, and no. For the remainder of this piece, I want to look more closely at the narratives surrounding domestic abuse and sexual violence. Specifically, the notion that these circumstances nearly always involve a male perpetrator and a female victim. Now, it is true that most violent crime in society is committed by men, and it is true that women are more often victims of sexual violence, particularly. But the unheard counterbalance of these truths is that the majority of domestic violence is bidirectional. That is, it's usually a man and a woman beating each other. And more than that, domestic abuse is basically symmetrical with regards to gender in all areas. When it comes to sexual violence, although, again, it probably affects women somewhat more than men, we are slowly starting to realize that women are far more likely to commit acts of sexual aggression against men than we have ever acknowledged. And in fact, rates of women sexually assaulting and even raping men are surprisingly high, likely at least half as frequent as assaults against women. Now, I want to look at both of these topics, domestic abuse and sexual violence, in turn. Now, domestic violence, I'll admit, doesn't have as much to do with Me Too, but it is still a significant contributor to the prevailing social narrative that men abuse women, hence why I want to look at it here. Also, in Nancy Pearcey's recent book, and this kind of demonstrates the issue here, she argued that domestic violence is strictly a matter of men abusing women. The statistic she cites in support of this primarily is that although 40% of all domestic violence is bidirectional, roughly 20% of domestic violence is severe, which usually affects women worse. And she concludes by saying, half of all women who are murdered are the victims of intimate partner violence. This demonstrates the severity of domestic violence as a woman's issue. But how does that claim stack up? Let's assume that it's correct here, that half of all women who are murdered are victims of intimate partner violence. Now, on its face, that sounds like an atrocious reality, and yes, it is. But if we look a little more closely at the numbers here than she does, her argument falls apart pretty quickly. According to the FBI Unified Crime Report for 2019, there were a total of 1,857 women murdered during that year, thus about 929 women murdered by an intimate partner. Now, if we extend this to an 80-year time period, or, an average person's lifetime, this equates to 74,320 women murdered by an intimate partner, assuming that rate remains consistent. Now, let's go ahead and round that number up to 80,000, so we have a nice, neat number. Out of a total population of roughly 250 million adults, and 125 million of those being women, that 80,000 women murdered by an intimate partner accounts for 0.00064% of the entire population of U.S. women. Furthermore, given the extraordinary nature of spousal homicide, I'm comfortable inferring that this number is probably symmetrical. That is, the number of women murdered by an intimate partner is probably about the same as the number of men who commit that crime. That is, we're probably going to figure it out, and I doubt very much that a man who is known to have murdered a previous spouse is likely to remarry. Now, by way of comparison to this number, the APA predicts that about 1.2% of the male population are psychopaths. This means that there are 1,875 times as many male psychopaths as men who would murder their partner. Even if we increase the number of women murdered tenfold, and there are some statistics that suggest that number, the likelihood of a woman marrying a man who will eventually beat her to death is nearly 200 times lower than the likelihood of a woman marrying a man who is a psychopath. And that doesn't even include the sum total of men who display all three of the dark triad personality traits: psychopathy, sociopathy, and narcissism. The fact of the matter is that Piercy's claim that rates of spousal homicide by men demonstrate that domestic violence is a women's issue, that claim is absurd. And it's a little more than a red herring to distract the reader from the fact that she has already acknowledged that at least 40% of all domestic violence is committed by women. Essentially, her argument is that because the consequences of domestic violence are worse for women, we should ignore their culpability for the culture of violence in which we live. Although the first is true, the second is absolutely false. I would say here as an aside that as Christians, we don't agree with Machiavelli that the ends justify the means, or that something is moral or immoral on the basis of its utility. Now, none of this, of course, is to say that spousal homicide is anything other than an extraordinary evil that we should oppose at every step. What I mean to demonstrate is that although Piercy points to spousal homicide as her primary reason why we should treat domestic violence as a gendered issue, spousal homicide simply does not support that conclusion. Rather, spousal homicide isn't a men's issue. It's a matter of people who are severely psychologically maldeveloped and in some cases probably abused. But there is more to say on this issue. It is true, again, that the majority of violent crime is committed by men. However, Warren Farrell reported close to 2,000 murders committed by women every year in 1993, and nearly all of their victims were men. But this probably doesn't reflect the total number of murders committed by women, because women typically use covert methods of engaging in murder, particularly poisoning and proxy, that is, hiring a hitman. Additionally, as Farrell points out, our legal system is set up so that women who do commit murder are not taken seriously, and they have multiple means of defending their actions in court. Put simply, physical size difference only really means that women are less capable of committing manslaughter or a murder of passion. Women are as intelligent as men and perfectly capable of finding ways around their smaller stature and strength, such as the use of weapons. And when women do this, we don't really pay attention to it. More significant than this is the fact that the studies that look at gender roles in domestic violence show essentially gender symmetry. Dr. Murray Strauss is responsible for the biggest body of research on this topic, and he conducted gendered studies of domestic violence for more than 30 years. In the process, he cataloged over 200 studies demonstrating that domestic violence is not a gendered issue. This was evident as early as the 1975 National Family Violence Survey. More importantly, contrary to popular belief, these statistics show no significant difference in tendency towards severe violence, including use of weapons, though men sustain only a third of the injuries and account for roughly a third of deaths related to domestic violence. I suspect on this point that the most violent men, who are more violent than the most violent women, probably never marry. Now, Strauss explains this, saying, "Bit by bit, my original assumption that domestic violence was about men dominating women has been contradicted by a mass of empirical evidence from my own research and from research by many others, which found that women physically attack partners at the same or higher rate as men, and that male dominance is only one of the many causes." Now, this being the case, why is this not common knowledge? Well, simply, it doesn't fit the prevailing cultural narrative. For example, media gamma bias, that is, the tendency for media outlets to gender news events to portray women positively and men negatively. An example of gamma bias was the Boko Haram incident several years back, where media were very concerned when several hundred women and girls were kidnapped. But every time Boko Haram attacked a school and murdered men and boys, it was reported that people had been killed. Now, the narrative of domestic violence also directly contradicts common legal practices, such as exemplified in the Duluth model, which portrays all men as perpetrators of violence against women and all women as victims. No other alternative is accepted. Now, because men remain the most violent overall when all violent crime is considered, women are also more frequently injured in domestic violence, meaning that women show up in hospital statistics more often. Women are more afraid of men than men are of women. We view male violence as more serious than women's violence overall. In fact, we assume that women are not violent. And in consequence of all of these different dynamics, the false information persists. Strauss specifically suggests that this persistence is due to a combination of concealment of the statistics, then denial, and finally distortion, in order to prevent this information from reaching mainstream acceptance, because there is some benefit that organizations derive from this narrative. Now, turning to the matter of sexual violence, there's more nuance here and less symmetry. Now, in 2006, scholars argued in an overview piece of domestic violence in the UK that although it was possible to imagine a woman sexually assaulting a man, it was considered implausible for a woman to commit an act of rape. The authors Michelle Davies and Paul Rogers report, because people are socialized to believe that women are sexually passive and men are sexual initiators, it is difficult to imagine a dominant woman coercing an unwilling man to have sex, or for the man to be unwilling if the opportunity for sex occurred. But in recent years, this notion has come under fire. In 2014, scholars Laura Stempel and Elon Meyer published their essay, "The Sexual Victimization of Men in America: New Data Challenge Old Assumptions." The paper presented data suggesting that men experience similar rates of being forced to penetrate, sometimes called forced envelopment, as women experience rape, and similar rates of unwanted sexual contact with women, though slightly lower rates of sexual coercion. Stempel and Meyer concluded, while recognizing and lamenting the threat that sexual victimization continues to pose for women and girls, we aim to bring into the fold the vast cohort of male victims who have been overlooked in research, media, and governmental responses. In doing so, we first argue that it is time to move past the male perpetrator and female victim paradigm. Over-reliance on it stigmatizes men who are victimized, risks portraying women as victims, and discourages discussion of abuse that run counter to the paradigm, such as same-sex abuse and female perpetration of sexual victimization. Subsequent studies have confirmed these claims. However, specifics of how much are so under-researched and so widely opposed in academic circles that these studies are largely useless. Much of the data on women sexually abusing men is over 50 years old, or it comes out of studies with incredibly small and therefore suspect sample sizes. Now, for those who might still be skeptical about the notion of a woman raping or sexually assaulting a man, the obvious barrier has to do with the physical plausibility of a woman gaining dominance in this way, both because women are smaller and because we assume that men have to have an erection in order to be assaulted in the first place, and men do not respond in this way in violent circumstances. Unfortunately, both of these perspectives are misunderstandings. On the matter of men's physical superiority to women, the same principles apply as with domestic violence. A woman can gain a physical advantage over a man by use of a weapon, such as in the case of Samantha Mears in 2018, who broke into her ex-boyfriend's home and forced him into having sex with her by threatening him with a machete she retrieved from among his possessions. Mears was not charged with rape and was not sentenced to prison time, despite clear medical and audio evidence of the act and a history of sexual violence against previous partners. Alternatively, a woman can drug her intended partner. And we saw this in Scripture in the case of Lot and his daughters. This is Genesis 19:30 through 38. The consequence of these women's decision to sleep with their father resulted in the creation of the Moabite and Ammonite tribes, who would later be counted among the greatest enemies of Israel. A third tool that women can use to gain an advantage over men is blackmail. Male arousal, the other roadblock here, is also misunderstood, partly because it can be difficult for men and women to understand how each of us responds in circumstances that are sexual. So a woman's sexual desire is largely based on her mental state and her relationship with the man in question. Now, although this is a component in men's sexual desire, there is a much larger physical component that is subconscious. And this makes sense when you think about it. Men are required to be sexually aroused in order for intercourse to take place and reproduction to occur. Because of this, it is to our advantage as a species that men not have to be emotionally in the mood necessarily to become erect. We want to create the circumstances for reproduction easily. And I'm sure that married women can attest that their partner, their husband, experiences sporadic erections throughout his sleep cycle, which an amorous woman might take advantage of if she so desired. We also might note here that a man being drunk or drugged is still capable of experiencing arousal, as in the case of Lot. Third, because erections are, in fact, mostly a subconscious phenomenon, a man is perfectly capable of becoming aroused in circumstances that are completely inappropriate, such as while he is being assaulted. If we were to take the misunderstanding we tend to have about male arousal and apply it to women, this would result in the belief that any woman who experiences vaginal lubrication while being raped must secretly desire that sexual act, and therefore we shouldn't acknowledge her as a rape victim. And I don't think it takes much imagination to point out how absurd and evil this approach would be. And lastly, on this matter, we tend to assume that men want sex at all times. But to go back to Peggy Orenstein's study of young boys, this isn't always true. In fact, there are plenty of times where men and boys don't want sexual intimacy, or they don't want intimacy with this particular woman, or they don't want intimacy right now, and men have been known to acquiesce to sexual encounters under those circumstances and even to fake orgasm. Orenstein summarizes this discovery when she writes, "At first, I dismissed boys' accounts of being sexually victimized. They're bigger than girls, after all, stronger. How hard could it be for them to just get up and walk away? Why not drink less? Were they really describing assault or just bad sexual encounters? And then I realized how I'd react if someone lobbed those same questions at a girl. Was it so different? Maybe my deeper fear was that surfacing boys' stories might distract from me too, dilute its message of systemic, pervasive sexual harassment and violation of women." And this is precisely the mode of thinking that gets in the way of understanding sexual violence as it applies to men. Now, overall, to throw out a basic number here, if I had to guess, and the numbers on this topic fluctuate all over the map, all across the spectrum, when it comes to the matter of cross-sex sexual violence, I would guess that roughly 40% is committed by women against men, or, say a ratio of 2 to 1 women to men as victims of sexual violence of the other. Now, there are some studies that suggest that there could be equal numbers here, but I'm skeptical of that. I'm not entirely convinced that there is true gender symmetry when it comes to sexual violence as with domestic violence. Hence why I'm more comfortable with the idea of, say, 2 to 1 or a 60-40 split. Now, my point here is not to diminish or poo-poo or dismiss women who have been sexually assaulted or raped. In fact, I'm comfortable with the numbers reporting on how often this takes place. And as with everyone else, I think it's horrifying that women have to experience that in a modern society. But my point is instead also that, although men experience slightly lower rates of these same crimes, they enjoy far less recognition and pretty much no social sympathy. Now, once again, I can refer to Dr. Warren Farrell's work. I'm not going to go into detail here specifically, but he argues, among other things, that false accusations of rape are significantly underreported, and in some circumstances that we ought to recognize as male rape, we just kind of gloss over them. An example of that is the case I cited above with Samantha Mears, and Farrell argues further that rape shield laws and popular misunderstandings of rape refuse to acknowledge women as potential perpetrators. We might hear some echoes here of Orenstein's comments. But the most interesting comments Farrell makes on the topic of sexual violence, in my opinion at least, they have to do with sexual harassment in public and in the workplace. And so we return to Me Too. Farrell points out that the challenge of balancing our policies in such a way that they prevent sexual harassment but don't interfere with workplace fraternization is an unavoidable problem, and one that we are never going to be able to solve to our satisfaction. A measure of discomfort here is unavoidable because the line between harassment and flirtation is almost entirely a matter of how the recipient feels about that interaction. If you look at some of the new and upcoming sexual harassment policies that schools and workplaces are adopting, it is notable that these policies often list unwanted sexual advances as a form of harassment. But how is one to know whether their sexual advances are unwanted without asking, and in asking thereby making a sexual advance? Thus the conundrum here. Now, naturally, situations like this are going to be more difficult for women who generally have a lower tolerance for social discomfort. And what comes with this is that the increased sexual freedom women enjoy as a result of the sexual revolution means that women have an increased risk in their sexual interactions. In this regard, I tend to agree with Camille Pallia's perspective that if women are asking for the freedom to be sexually promiscuous, they also need to be asking for the risk that comes with that as well. Let women decide how they choose to behave, both the positive and the negative. Now, when it comes to workplace harassment, there are some positives for us to consider, and I think that there is space to hope that we can find some sort of a balance of flexibility in the workplace regarding harassment versus flirtation, so long as we can accept this reality that there's always going to be a level of discomfort in the workplace. As I said earlier, all romantic interaction requires vulnerability and risk. So no romantic interaction can be purged of social discomfort. This is especially the case given that men are actually more aware of what constitutes harassment than we are typically led to believe. And even better, the majority of the time, if you tell a decent man that you're not okay with his behavior, he will usually self-correct immediately. Now, this is a positive because it should be easier to identify good men from actual abusers. You tell a good man, I don't want this behavior, usually they'll correct themselves, whereas an abuser is more likely to continue. But in the midst of a Me Too society, the reality is that it is difficult and I think perhaps even dangerous for any kind of sexual tension in the workplace, even a simple matter of flirtation. And this difficulty and even potential danger is rooted, I think, in the narratives we have of concealment, denial, and distortion that prevent us from seeing that this isn't really a one-directional issue. So, the reality is, even if we can deal with Me Too, though, ultimately there will always be men who behave inappropriately and need to be separated from women. So whether we are able to address our concerns, our discomfort, our disagreement at all, there is always going to be more to deal with, more questions to ask, more barriers to overcome, and the continuing reality of sin. Now, this kind of brings me to my final question, which is, how did we come to the place where this is what is taking place in society? How did we come to the point where we accept, even encourage the belief that men oppress women and that's just kind of all there is to it? How did the relationship between men and women become so antagonistic? How did we get to the place where we can't even really engage in interaction with one another except in very particular social circumstances? Now, one reason why we have maintained this story, I think, is the time-honored narrative that women civilize men, sometimes understood as the angel in the house narrative based on a 19th century poem, and in recent times identified in sociology as the women are wonderful effect. More importantly, I suspect that we have a subliminal desire to view women in this way. Seeing women as morally superior is something that brings benefit to men and to women. Women benefit from the idea that they are morally superior because it gives women a social edge in interactions with men and makes it easier to force policy changes that help women to be more comfortable interacting with men in society. There is an advantage here. On the other hand, for men, believing that women are morally superior as a rule gives individual men something against which to compare themselves. It's easier for an individual man to say, yeah, I know most men are abusive and awful and dangerous to women, but I'm not like one of those men out there. I'm superior. I will defend and care for and respect the women that I interact with. When in fact, the ideal should be that all men behave that way. Now, another thing that we can point to here is the gender variance hypothesis. One of the crucial differences I've mentioned in previous works between the sexes is that men tend to trend in the direction of risk-taking and differentiation, whereas women prefer to be kind of average because in the average is stability. As a result, if we look at the most violent members of society, most of them tend to be men. But let's think about this in a broader perspective. It's true that the people responsible for destroying empires in the past have usually been male warlords. But men have also been responsible for building up new empires. Whether we judge men on the basis of destroying empires or building empires, either way is a form of the cherry-picking fallacy. In contrast, women have been prone neither to extraordinary acts of greatness or extraordinary acts of evil, at least not on the scale of building and destroying empires in the same way that men are, though it's worth pointing out that the role women play in childbearing really can't be undervalued or understated. Now, on the other hand, this positive that women don't really do terrible evil in society is kind of offset by the fact that women who are responsible for actions of that sort, they're rarely held accountable for those actions. So, comparing these two pictures, men who build and destroy empires, women who bear children but don't really rock the boat very much and yet on the other hand, aren't held accountable for when they do. It's hard to say that one of these is better or worse than the other. And the fact is, I don't think that either side is better or worse, and I don't even think either side is necessarily malicious, per se. This differentiation is the result of the fall. We see in Genesis 3:16, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, to understand that, we need to contrast it with Genesis 4:7, where God warns Cain, behold, sin is crouching at your door, desiring to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, if we compare these two passages with one another, it suggests that the desire God ascribes to women in Genesis 3 for their husband, this isn't an expression of love. It's not a desire to be united with her husband. Rather, it's a desire to consume and control in the same way that sin desires to consume and control us. And in the Genesis passage, this is balanced not by a benevolent headship on the part of the husband, but a form of tyranny. And this shows a stronger parallel in that passage and clarifies somewhat what God is talking about. In light of this, we can't really say that men oppress women, or if women oppress men, or that women oppress men. Rather, the reality is that we abuse and mistreat each other. And this is a reality that is quite literally as old as sin. Now, there's a third passage in Scripture that takes up this imagery that is worth considering, and this is in the Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 10. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. We find in the Song of Songs this beautiful back and forth between a man and a woman writing love poetry for each other and expressing not so much a desire to possess or to rule or to manipulate, but just a desire to continue in connection and in relationship with. There is this sense of two people who are oriented towards each other, and you can't get them to turn away. And this shows, I think, that Christian anthropology, that we need one another, we ought to desire one another, and we ought to be asking, what do we need to do in order to serve each other, rather than, what can I get out of this? And if we can adopt this image, if we can remember that we are all in this together and leave our guns at the door, then there's a possibility, I think, of reversing this trend of suspicion, distrust, and even hatred. Comparative victimhood is useful if we use it to allocate resources appropriately to those in need. But when comparing victimhood leads to greater suffering and antagonism between two groups, then that victimhood has outlived its usefulness and is good for nothing but to be thrown into the fire. So too, in my opinion, Me Too and similar movements might genuinely be rooted in healthy desires, but the damage they're doing renders them useless and good for nothing but to be thrown in the fire. Now, I'll say one more time, it is really important for us to recognize and address the pain of women's experiences of sexual and physical violence in our society. I've known a number of women who have experienced this, and I have grieved with them, and I am very concerned over this. But I hope that we can turn from seeing this as a back and forth to being a both and. The need for us to ask, how are we loving each other? What are we giving? And what is good in this relationship? Those are the crucial needs. And in my opinion, those needs really eclipse all other considerations at this point. When two people have fallen to the floor together, they can continue to slug it out, or they can choose to help each other up. And this brings me to the end of this long and difficult exposition of the challenges of intersexual violence and abuse and their effect on modern courtship. I have discussed how the Me Too movement and similar phenomena, such as Title IX, have created a culture of suspicion between men and women, particularly in the workplace. This culture discourages romantic overtures and flirtation in arenas where these have historically been common and even welcome. Furthermore, this culture of suspicion, particularly in the workplace, is born out of the mistaken belief that men are abusive and women are victims, when the reality is that men and women really abuse each other at similar rates. Slightly more abuse perpetrated by men against women than the inverse, particularly with regards to sexual abuse. We do not live in a simplistic society where good and evil can be identified easily, but one where good and evil, like the wheat and the tares, are present together in all areas of our lives. Now, the next essay that I present will close out my work on the backdrop of the decline of marriage and courtship with a look at the rise and the effect of so-called queer theory. What is it? What does it say? Where does it come from? And following that essay, I will then move on to the final and the most important, I think, section of this whole project, which is what should we be doing if courtship and marriage are to be salvaged? So, until the next time, I am here signing off.